guys, it's Sam. Welcome back to Vlogmas. And today's video is a combined wrap up for October and November. In case you kind of missed this saga, I was going to, and actually did film a October wrap up while I was traveling. However, at the beginning of November, I was sick because I got a cold along with like everyone else in the world, it seems like. So I didn't feel well, so I had to wait until I felt well enough. Then I did film it, but I felt like crap. And then my computer broke on the trip, and so I couldn't edit anything. And by the time I got back, it was nearly the end of November, so I was like, I'm just gonna combine the two. So you get some of my October spooky reading, and then you get, in addition to some fiction books that I read in November, a lot of nonfiction November, because I read a bunch of nonfiction books. And in total, between the 2 months, I read 16 books. A lot to talk about. Let's get into it. The first book I read in October was Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is a book that so many people have talked about, so I really don't feel like I have to go into too much detail. This is also our Household Book Club pick for... It wasn't for October, it was for September. Yeah, we did it late, that's why. I was like, what happened? So this is our Household Book Club pick. We have a live show for it, and I also did a standalone review of it as well. This has a bunch of triggers for child abuse, sexism, racism, colonialism, and is a standalone adult historical fantasy that follows the main character of Robin, who is a biracial boy who is living in China. His entire family ends up dying from a plague, and he ends up getting taken sort of by a mysterious benefactor who is a white man to England at the, I believe it's like late 1800s, early 1900s, in order to be trained and tutored to be a part of the Oxford translation part of Oxford, which is where the magic and stuff works, called Babel. So I've mentioned this a bunch of different places. I am sort of sick of talking about this book over the last couple of months because it has been such a big book and a lot of people are talking about it, and I talked about it in a lot of different places. But this, I understood the project and I appreciate what it was trying to do. It just didn't necessarily resonate in an emotional capacity as far as like the storytelling part of it, if that makes sense. The thesis of this book lands. I think that R.F. Kuang is a really great writer. I will continue to read books that she puts out. However, this book felt much more at a distance and felt much more like almost an essay, and was much more theme heavy and talking about the themes, and the characters were really used as mouthpieces for those themes in a way that felt a bit clunky. I also think R.F. Kuang struggles a little bit with like pacing and things, and so like the way she just depicts passage of time in all of her books I've read so far is not my favorite. The magic system of this and the way the translation is talked about in the way that colonialism uses language and things like that, all of that is excellent. It just definitely felt like a separation from our characters, even more so than I did in the Poppy War, and there was parts of the Poppy War where I felt separated from our characters, but at least in the Poppy War I felt connected to Rin, who was our main character. Here I didn't really feel connected to any of them, and I also felt that there was an opportunity among some of the side characters to flesh them out more and get more of their story. It would have made the story much more richer. So overall, not a bad book. Again, I've talked in detail other places about it, so I don't want to go into it too much here, but I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. Solid, but not as great for me as far as the execution as it has been for a lot of people. Then I read Juniper and Thorne by Ava Reid. This has been a year where I've like dipped my toe into gothic horror, and I like the water in there. The water's nice. I've also done, I believe, yes, I've done a full review for this as well. So again, don't want to go into too much detail here, but this is a standalone adult gothic horror story. It's taking place, I think, kind of around the turn of the century in a Eastern European inspired fantasy setting. So our main character is one of the 3 daughters of the last like wizard in this town. Her dad is a bad man. He does a lot of bad things. He's incredibly racist and xenophobic and sexist and is very controlling of them. So this is a dark story. There are a ton of triggers in here. I'm going to tell you all of them, but please also look them up in case I miss any. So death of a parent, sexual assault, anti-Semitism, self-harm, brutal depictions, very graphic depictions of eating disorders, cannibalism, xenophobia, murder, and emotional abuse and gore. A lot of like body horror type stuff. This book is overall very unsettling. So if you have any problems with any of those triggers, like all of those things are very graphically described. The killing of animals, like there's a lot. So just know that before you go into this. I don't have like any of those triggers really myself, and I was uncomfortable by this book, but you're supposed to be. So this was a success for me in that this genre of horror of like discomfort, I really like. This like gothic, atmospheric setting. We have our main character who, like I said, is from this very abusive family. Her and her sisters end up at the very beginning of the story like going away at night, like sneaking out and stuff, and that sort of opens their world up to a little bit more, and then things start to sort of unravel from there. Ava Reid has quickly become one of my favorite authors. I really appreciate how they use like atmosphere and setting. This is taking place in the same world as The Wolf and the Woodsman, but not at the same time, and they're not at all connected. But the way that she uses different descriptions to just evoke such deep discomfort, and in a way that's not gratuitous. It's graphic, but it's not gratuitous, and you're supposed to be uncomfortable. In this book in particular, the way she juxtaposed like sexual content that is consensual with deeply unsettling content, like horror and discomfort at its base. Really interesting just exploration of this sort of like abusive dynamic, these family dynamics, and this girl slash woman trying to come into her own agency, what it is to be a monster, like all of these philosophical ideas and themes with also a lot of heart, because I really felt like all of these characters, and this like in like deeply unsettling atmospheric nature, and like Ava Reed's writing is so good. So I loved this. It's 5 stars for me, but this is definitely not gonna be for everybody. I know that not everyone's gonna like this. It's not a book that everyone is supposed to like, and just check, because it's uncomfortable. It's an uncomfy book. Next, I read Burnt Offerings by Laurel K. Hamilton. This is book, I should have checked before I did this, but I think it's like 7 or 8 of the Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series, which I've been rereading throughout this year on audiobook. This has much more to do with sort of like the meta plot. In this one, a bunch of the like sort of council, for lack of a better term, they might be called the council, I'm forgetting what they're actually called, but almost like the council of vampires are coming in and figuring out what's going on in the city where Anita's living, and like she stirred up some shit, and so now like the supervisors are trying to come in. So it's a lot of just like power dynamics and like power play, a little bit less about like the monster of the week plot or the like police activity or things that it usually is. This is when the series starts to go much more into like the meta plot of her and all the characters she's interacting with. This one is much heavier than the other ones have been. I mean, I'm pretty used to sort of like the horror elements of this series, but there's a lot of gore in this one. Body horror, torture, and like on page discussions at least of rape and depictions, I think, in this one as well. So this is a rougher one, honestly. This one's not my favorite for that reason, because it felt bordering on gratuitous. I think Laurel K. Hamilton handles dark topics well, but I don't really know why she inserted so much more like graphic detail about these things in this particular installment. Urban fantasy has a lot of like SA as a theme within it, and she hasn't gotten this much into it before in the past. And then this is just like, things are weird pacing wise and the way that things wrap up. So this wasn't quite as much of like a satisfying story, but you still get a lot of introductions of new characters that I know because I read more of them that are important power players come up in this book, and just moving that meta plot along. But not my favorite installment of like the earlier books in the series. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. I then read Nona the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. This is the 3rd book in the Locked Tomb series, which is an adult sci-fi fantasy mix about necromancers in space. It's a very weird series, and I have reviews for all the books, including this one, up on my channel, and like a discussion of this as well. Because this is book 3, I can't go into much detail, but I will say that every book in this series is tonally different. You can definitely, there's a thread all throughout them, but each one is slightly different. Book 1 is kind of a closed circle murder mystery element with like necromancy space stuff. Book 2 is much more like space opera feeling, and as a mindfuck. Book 3 is also a mindfuck in a lesser way and is more slice of life, less sci-fi. This does have triggers for depictions of an eating disorder, blood, gore, and gun violence. This series and this book and installment I still enjoy, but this one was my least favorite so far of the books in the series. This feels very much like a side quest, and I understand that it's important, and I think a lot of things will tie back in, but it depends on how you feel about this sort of like side quest and the characters that you're with and like what's happening. There's some unreliable narrator stuff going on that kind of happens throughout the series, honestly. This series overall is kind of confusing. It's not confusing when you're reading it and like you understand the words on the page, but to fully understand the story, you kind of have to like go back and reread stuff and like really do deep dives, and I rely on the fandom for that. There are so many people in this fandom who are like so into it and have like charts and things, and like that's where I grasp all these little pieces. She does so much with just like little hints, and it's wild to me. But this one, the like content, we were missing a lot of like the sci-fi and necromancy stuff. And that's what keeps me going when shit gets weird in this series and I don't know what's going on, is like the creepy bone shit is my favorite. And there was less of that here, so there was kind of less to sustain me, and I wasn't caring so much about the story that was happening on page, and I also wasn't catching all of those extra details that are like so meta level in a lot of ways, that this one wasn't as enjoyable as other installments have been. So I gave this one 3.75 out of 5 stars. I liked the ending and I like where this is going, and book 4, which is the final book, is going to tie everything together, and I can't wait to see how it's going to be tied together. And I will continue to read Tamsin Muir's books because I think that, like, genius quality, honestly. This installment just wasn't my favorite. It's not one that I would really necessarily want to reread, and I'm just not a like big rereader of the series in general, because it's a mindfuck, and like scrambled eggs up here when I'm reading those. I then read Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. I've recently done a full review on this one as well. This is a standalone adult, again, gothic horror story that is the depiction of the relationship between Dracula and his brides. This is not a retelling, but this is just like a slightly sort of inspired by, because it doesn't follow the exact beats of Dracula, but is using the Dracula story and like making it its own, and is really like the second person narration of one of the main brides writing letters to Dracula after he has already died. There's some things that you already like know about from the way that she's like hinting at things. This is also a darker story, so there's triggers in here for blood, because, you know, vampire story, mental illness like mania, a toxic relationship, abuse, and gaslighting. So anything about like a narcissistic abusive relationship is going to be in here. There's like physical abuse, emotional abuse, things like that. If that's triggering to you, this is a complete depiction of that kind of relationship and people overcoming that kind of relationship. But if that's triggering content, steer clear of this. Like I just said, this is just a depiction of their relationship and people overcoming abuse, essentially, and like what happens within abusive dynamics. There's also some like polyamory and stuff that's happening here, because all of the brides also love each other, and so there's some interesting dynamics there. And this is just like, again, a character study in character relationships and things. This wasn't perfect for me. It's so atmospheric. I really loved the characters, but there's parts about the end that are a little bit, they come together a little bit too easily for a gothic horror story, in my opinion. It's a little bit too clean cut and a little bit too like bright and shiny at the end. But I also don't mind that from the perspective of like someone's overcome abuse and like they deserve happiness, right? But it just felt like tonally off to me. But overall, I really loved this. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I then read Monstrous Volume 4 by Sana Takeda and Marjorie Liu, because I'm trying to catch up on Monstrous before the end of the year. I think I'm gonna read at least 1, if not 2 more volumes, hopefully in December. We will see. This has triggers for gore, violence, war, possession, and torture. Yes, I read some dark books. I feel like gore is in almost every book for a trigger warning for me these days. Like I said, this is the 4th installment of this series, but this is a adult graphic novel series that follows a main character who has been through war. She is part of like this sort of arcane group, which is sort of a mix of magical people with like humans, and is like a persecuted, marginalized group. She also happens to be possessed by an eldritch horror, an eldritch being, and that causes problems, and she's just like an important person within this world and doesn't quite know how important she is, doesn't quite know how all of her powers work. People are seeking her. Everyone is morally gray. So yeah, this one felt like, again, sort of a bit of a side quest. There's like the side thing that sort of has to happen where we get a little bit off track of like the main point. There are some things that are sort of resolved, but this one wasn't as, it's still action-packed, but it wasn't as like important to the big plot as others have been, and it felt like we got a little bit sidetracked with this one. Still love it. The art is gorgeous in this, and it is one of my favorite graphic novel series of all time. But I gave this installment 3.75 stars. And lastly, for October, I read Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. This is a standalone adult historical fantasy science fiction. It's a retelling of Dr. Moreau, but it's set in Mexico in, turn of the century, I want to say. This does have triggers for alcoholism, gun violence, racism, and body horror. And this follows a main character who is the daughter of Dr. Moreau. So if you know the Dr. Moreau story, at least even culturally, which that's all I knew about it from before I read it, he's sort of this mad scientist character that is secluded away. And in this, he's obviously in like a secluded part of Mexico. And this is sort of this, there's slice of lifey moments, but basically her figuring out who she is, things about her dad, things about this area, people coming in, like rich and wealthy people coming in and trying to shake things up, that kind of thing. This was fine. We just did a House Salt live show on this literally today as of the day I'm filming. So you can check that out for more of our thoughts, and we all kind of had similar thoughts on this. This is very forgettable for me. The themes of this is like more theme heavy, but I feel like it didn't really have like the heart, kind of similar to how I felt about Babel, honestly, where I didn't really care about the characters. I felt like it was missing some things. It felt pretty slow at times, and yeah, I forgot a lot about the story once I was finished with it. I don't think that this is quite as strong as some of her other books I've read. I've also read Mexican Gothic and Gods of Jade and Shadow, and I find those to be much stronger and for you to care like more about the main characters than I personally did for this one. So this was fine. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then November started. So I was still reading some fiction books here and there. I was actually still trying to finish up a book from October in November. So I read a few fiction books, but mostly I read books for nonfiction November, which was pretty successful overall. So the first book that I finished was The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow. This is a book I put off for so long, and I'm so mad at myself for doing so because I really liked this. This is a standalone adult historical fantasy. This takes place right around the times of the suffragette movement, but it's taking place in New Salem, and it follows 3 sisters who are our 3 main characters who are witches, and they kind of encounter witchcraft as a way to work through sort of like the sexism of the time, and just to find community. And obviously they're persecuted for this, and there's so much to this and like the different themes here, but that's like the baseline of the story. I didn't read this for a long time because I thought it was mostly going to be more historical fiction, because that's what her other book more so was. This is so much more magical, so witchy, and I really liked it. I will be doing a full spoiler-free review later on in Vlogmas, where I'll talk about this more. There are triggers in here for misogyny, racism, sexism, homophobia, and child abuse. There's also mentions of death of family members and abortion. The setting in here is really good as far as just like New Salem suffragette movement time period. The suffragette movement isn't even a big part of this. This is much more about like the witchcraft movement within this like fictional world. I really loved our characters. What I appreciate is that they do this like mother maiden crone thing for an archetype, which is a witchy archetype, with these 3 sisters. So they embody that. There's also the use of fairy tales as spells and like the way to pass down witchcraft, and using fairy tales as being much more like women focused, and just again how we use fairy tales to like talk about morality and things. I think the weakest part of this was probably the villain, although I didn't actually mind the villain that much either. I think some of the ways that that was done was still like really good, because at first I thought it was going to be very like flat, but that was good. And then there are small, it's a subplot, but there are 2 romances in here, and I really liked both of them. One is a sapphic relationship, and that is with a woman of color who is a part of another sort of like witchcraft movement that is very rooted culturally, which I think was done really well. And then with a guy who is giving me just like such good vibes, because he falls in love with the pregnant woman, one of the sisters, and not his baby, and he's like all for her ride or die. So I really liked this. I liked almost every element of this. I gave this a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Again, I'm gonna be talking about this more in my review, but I listened to this on audiobook, and I highly recommend it because the audiobook is so good, and the voices she uses are really good as well. So sad I put this off for so long. I went so back and forth with this for a long time, and I talked to a lot of you about this book and like if I should read it or if I should not, and I'm glad that I did. Her other books have been kind of shaky for me, which is why I was so skeptical about this one, but this one I think is super solid. Then another book that I finished up from October was Saint Death's Daughter by C.S.E. Cooney. This is such a weird little book. I'm also doing a full review on this one because I cannot even fully explain all of this in a wrap up like this. I do not have enough time. This is the first book in what's going to be a series. I don't know how many books are going to be in this series, but it's a adult fantasy, sort of like gothic feel, necromancy type book. Follows your main character who is a part of a necromancer slash assassin family. She is one of the strongest necromancers that they've had in quite some time. Her name's Lainey, and she is like coming into her power, but she also comes from this family that is very violent, and she's actually allergic to violence. So she hears about death or like sees it, she gets those things on her body. It's sort of like the flip side of like her necromantic power. And her parents die at the beginning of the story, and they are in a ton of debt, and so they're about to lose their house. If they lose their house, they also lose the revenant attached to the house, which is essentially her best friend, Goody Graves. So she has to call her abusive sister back from where she is sort of internationally, I guess you could say. And her sister brings back a man from another country who almost has like bird magic, like he can turn into a bird. I know this is so wild, guys. I'm trying to like depict to you what this is. And like that unleashes a bunch of dynamics. So this has, I talked about this a little bit on TikTok recently. This has the weird bone shit of like the Locked Tomb series that I mentioned earlier, but in a fantasy setting. It also has crazy bird magic. It has a unique pantheon of gods. Saint Death is one of her gods, so she has like a connection to like a death god. You guys know I love that. There's so much. And this has very complex and at times clunky world building. I would say that's the weakest part of the story. And the pacing can be like a little slow at times too, but I was also reading this on vacation and didn't really have time to sink into it the way that I probably would have if I wasn't on vacation. So, because I didn't mention this, there are triggers for chronic illness, self-harm, murder, gore, blood, torture, all the things that are in all the books basically. But this is like so weird, but I think this could get a really good following of people reading this. It's very unique. Again, the world building can be very clunky. That is one of the downsides. And at first I didn't know that this wasn't a standalone. So when I finished it, I was like, a lot of things didn't get wrapped up, and then I realized it's supposed to be the first book in a series. So just know that it doesn't leave it off on a cliffhanger, but there's unresolved threads, right? Because it's a series. But yeah, it's weird. They do some weird stuff with like gender, and culturally how they like mess with gender. Her love interest is a non-binary fire priest. There's just a lot. There's a lot going on world building wise, but if you like weird bone shit, if you like people that have ties to death gods, if you like a pantheon of different gods and them being sort of involved in things and messing with people, you'll like this. It's a weird little book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then started mostly my nonfiction November reading. So if you want me to do any full reviews on any of these nonfiction books, since most of them are psychology based, I'll be doing them over on my other channel. So let me know in the comments if you want a full review on any of these. And if I feel like I have enough to talk about with any of them, I will do a full review over there. First is The Invisible Kingdom by Megan O'Rourke. This is a nonfiction book about a chronic illness and living with chronic illness and sort of all the things that impact chronic illness. So it's sort of part memoir because Megan O'Rourke is somebody who has suffered from chronic illnesses for quite some time, and sort of her journey and her talking about everything that she's going through. But she also interviewed like doctors, looked at research, interviewed other chronically ill people to get information about the experience of chronic illness, particularly within the United States. One of my niches in therapy, which is my main job, is chronic illness, and I do a lot of long COVID support groups. So this was very relevant for that, and was really nice to read things that like I knew from just like case study of people that I've talked to and like experiences that people I've talked to have had and that I've even had within the medical system as like someone that had cancer, and there's like overlap there. And hearing it as like studied research, I'm like, I knew that, and I'm glad that the research backs it up about like how doctors brush people off, how doctors don't know how to handle chronic illness, how they blame it on mental health so often because they don't know what to do when they feel inadequate, a lot of those kinds of things. And just her discussion of different things that she sought out and the change in identity and the grief process and all of that, it was really good. I highly recommend it for anybody who is going through a chronic illness or knows someone that is. Gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I then read Regretting Motherhood by Orna Danath. And this is, like the title says, this is a very small case study that this author did in Israel. I think she talked to like maybe 14 to 20 women. I mean, not a very large group. So again, it's a case study, but talking about regretting motherhood and the different ideas people have about women who regret their motherhood, and just the idea that not everyone loves motherhood, the messages that we get about motherhood, and that like everything is worth it, if people would change things if they could, and while that can all be true and they can regret their motherhood without hating their children. So this is just kind of a discussion of that. This was fine. It reads pretty clinical, and again, because it's not universally applied information, like there are definitely things that I've heard from women who have had children and regret it, or just like the child-free community and things like that, but you know, it's not universally applicable like research, because this is just a few people's experience, but she still covers like all these topics and how people react to people who feel this way. The major discussion here is just that like women need another choice socially and in a societal way, and we're moving towards that, but it's still very much not seen as like a real choice to make to be child-free completely, and people view women who are as like very selfish and all of these things. And this is just talking about how women need another like actual choice, because being essentially forced to regret being a mom is a very sad experience, and no one wants that. So this was just fine. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. It wasn't necessarily teaching me anything like new, but was like a good jumping off point for this conversation. Then I read I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. This is a wildly popular memoir that came out this year, and is written by Jeanette, who is a former Nickelodeon child star. She was on iCarly. That was after my time, so I'm not super familiar with her, but this is mostly like her life and her childhood, and most of it is talking about her relationship with her incredibly abusive, narcissistic mother who did pass away. So this has some really heavy topics. This covers child abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. It has sexual content, very graphic depictions of an eating disorder, and obviously death of a parent. I listened to this on audiobook, and that's the way I would recommend listening to this. That's usually the recommendation for memoirs, especially ones that are read by the author, which this one is. This is heavy, but the way that she, again, depicted a lot of this stuff in this very string of consciousness, feeling like you're in her head during all this time, and her acknowledgement of like her role in things when she was being toxic, the role of sort of PTSD and all of this, and the way that like narcissistic abuse from her mom like really shaped her whole life, and how she's trying to take her life back. So again, very heavy, but ultimately I enjoyed it and gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I also listened to The Broken Kingdoms, which is the second book in the Inheritance trilogy. I have the giant bind up, so that's why I'm holding this one up. This takes place after the events of book 1, so I can't really go into it. It follows totally different characters. Some of the same characters do pop up, but they are not main characters in the story like they were in book 1. This does have triggers for gore, blood, murder, and so far these books are just fine. These, for N.K. Jemisin, lean so much more heavily on a romance subplot that is almost like the main plot. Not quite, but like almost. And it is so, it's not her strong suit. Like the romances feel so stilted and like not organic, and you also don't necessarily know why these two people even like really like each other and are together. And there's also this like really interesting, like the world and stuff is really interesting because you have these gods like and godlings and these godlike beings sort of walking among us, and they all live on this like world tree kind of situation, and there's different separations of people within that like tree as far as like the city and things. So it's really cool as far as that stuff, but I always get kind of like the ick by the romance stuff. And yeah, like those depictions are not my favorite. And also just like the gods are like related, but they also sort of like Greek gods and things like that. They also have like relationships with each other, but we're reminded of all the time in a way that's so uncomfy. Even in this age of House of the Dragon, I can't. So yeah, I don't love these. I will finish this series out though. I'm intrigued enough, and they're all kind of companions. You have to read them all like back to back to kind of know what's going on, but they take place over time, which I do tend to really like, this like passage of time within a series and following different characters. So I'm interested enough, and I like N.K. Jemisin enough to read her backlist, but I can definitely tell this is her first series, and how her writing has so improved since then. So I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. I then read Polysecure by Jessica Fern, and this is a book about attachment, but it also applies attachment to polyamorous or non-monogamous relationships. And this book I primarily read for work because it's another like book on attachment. This book is so good, and I really recommend anyone in any style of relationship read this, whether you're monogamous, polyamorous, any of that. The attachment parts of this, so this book is broken up into I think 3 or 4 parts, but part 1 is all attachment stuff, and this book is better than Attached, which is the book that I have read recently as well, but that originally I recommended to a lot of my clients and stuff on attachment. But Attached is so dry and only really applies to like monogamous, and it's also like older research and stuff, and the way that they villainize certain attachment styles I didn't like. This one breaks it down so much better, doesn't villainize any of the attachment styles, and is so good in that way. The second part is talking about attachment and trauma, again, for anyone. So that is really strong, which a lot of books didn't really tie in the trauma piece. The third part is more about like attachment and polyamory or like non-monogamy, so if that doesn't apply to you, you can skip it. The fourth part still does have some things about like polyamory in it, but really can apply to anybody, and it's how to heal attachment wounds if you're single or in a relationship. It's so good. It's very accessible. It has enough information. It has a lot of like citing references and things, so there's a whole bibliography in the back. I love to see that in a nonfiction book, especially about psychology. It has a lot of like journaling prompts, even though it's not like a workbook. It has a lot of things to sort of like ask yourself to work through. It's one of the best books on like psychology and attachment theory that I've read, and it's like more recent, and so it's like some of the most recent stuff about attachment. So anybody that's in a relationship, I think, should read this. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. She's coming out next year with a book called Polywise, which is more for polyamory and like non-monogamy and stuff. But I will probably continue to read her books because she's a really good writer, and the way that she talks about relationships, she does it in a way that can apply to any relationship like lifestyle, which is great. I then read How to Do the Work by Dr. Nicole LaPera. This is a woman who's very popular on apparently Instagram about like, has a psychology Instagram. I'm not familiar with her before reading this, but this is essentially talking about like how to do the work of therapy. Now there are things about this that I know will not really vibe with everyone, and I think you have to be a little bit discerning to like pick some of the stuff out that like applies to you and leave the stuff that doesn't. This is a very shallow discussion of a bunch of different methods sort of used in therapy. Not all of them. Again, she calls herself like the holistic psychologist because she pulls in a bunch of different things, but she does use a lot of different like things from therapy practices and talks about a lot of them in here. And so like each chapter is kind of a different thing. And she has like journaling prompts and things like that. Some things I think were really good. Some things I think were less good. Binks is like screaming at the door because I've been in here for a while talking about books. But I think the way she writes is really accessible. I think this is a good primer for people who are maybe nervous to get into therapy or in therapy themselves and are like not sure what to like do, want some like self-exploration, self-awareness stuff. There's definitely things that I feel like were applicable in here that even I could use. But then there was also stuff where she got like a little bit too like woo-woo out there. You can just like fix your life by like reframing your thoughts, and like that's not true. Like I don't think she takes into account, she mentions it here and there, but she doesn't really go into it about like, you know, sometimes society's just fucked up and like we can't do anything about that, and like people have trauma, and like she just it's a short book and she doesn't go deep enough necessarily there, but I don't think that's even what she was trying to do. And I think this is just supposed to be again like a just base of simple things to kind of do. So yeah, you are not going to be able to like cure your mental illness with like this book, but increasing self-awareness and increasing like emotional stability and things like that, there are definitely things in here that will help with that. So I like this overall. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, maybe a little bit lower, maybe like a 3.75. It was fine. There's, again, you have to piece through some things and be okay with that, and be okay with a little bit of like woo-woo in there, which I'm okay with. And lastly, I read Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Y. Davis. This is the book that my Patreon supporters voted on for me to definitely get to, and I did. I just had access to this one like all month because one of the libraries that I have a card for just has unlimited copies of this, which is really good. There's certain titles that they give you like unlimited access to, so all these other ones like I had only a certain amount of time to read, and this one I had slightly more time with. Also a very short book. I think it's like 100 and something pages, but this is exactly what it says on the tin. This is talking about the prison industrial complex, particularly in America, although it talks about some other countries as well, and our prisons as a system of reform and things like, what are they and are they obsolete? And honestly, when I got to the end of this book, as like is the intention, my answer was like, yeah, this is wild. I knew some things about the prison industrial complex, but not nearly as much as what this teaches. And it is wild. Like I already knew that there was like some fucked up stuff, but it is wild. She does talk about the how prisons are sort of like used as modern day slavery, like how things have evolved from slavery, and she like completely pinpoints it. The conditions within prisons, the way that people, like there are companies paid per prisoner. Like, so there's incentive to have a lot of prisoners, and the way that our sheer amount of prisoners has just infinitely increased when crime has actually gone down without even having like the prisoner, like, and the lack of like reform and just keeping people there to be able to then sell things to prisons, and like it is a messed up system. It does not have, and the intention isn't to have this, but it does not have a ton about like what alternatives are. There's like a chapter at the very end that kind of has some stuff, like very basic, like here's sort of a starting point, but I do want to do some more reading in the future on like, what are the alternatives, because I will now be like fighting people about prisons. I knew it was bad, but like there are things that I like, as I was reading, I was feeling my face go like in like horror at some of the just atrocities that happen within prisons. So yeah, and she does talk about like, okay, what do we do about people who like genuinely shouldn't be around people because they've like murdered people and things like that. She talks about that at the end, but I need more information for that because I know that's gonna be people's main argument when I bring this up, or I won't bring it up necessarily, but like when it comes up. So yeah, this is a very good starting point. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. So yeah, those are all the books that I read the last 2 months. Phew. So yeah, you'll be getting a lot of Vlogmas content, so you'll be hearing about a lot of these books, at least the fiction ones here. If you want me to do reviews for any of the nonfiction ones more in depth, I can talk about that on my other channel. So comment below, let me know if you've read any of these and what you thought about them and how your reading months have gone the last couple of months. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.